You know, for decades, the question, could a machine be conscious, was straight out of science fiction. But with the incredible breakthroughs we're seeing in artificial intelligence, it's not really a matter of if anymore. It's when, and maybe more importantly, how on earth will we know? A question that used to be for novels is now one of the most urgent realities we're facing.
I mean, just think about that for a second. The moment an AI becomes self-aware, that changes everything. It would go from being a tool that just follows our commands to a being that thinks for itself, that questions things, and maybe starts making its own decisions. Does it want freedom? Does it want rights? Or does it maybe see us as an obstacle? This isn't just a software update. It's a complete shift in the nature of intelligence on this planet.
And yeah, that shift immediately throws us into this huge ethical minefield. As the philosopher Susan Schneier points out, the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. Consciousness is pretty much the foundation of our entire moral system. So if we get this wrong, we risk committing a moral atrocity on a scale that's, well, it's hard to even wrap your head around.
So, let's get into it. The great unknown, the hardest problem in science. Now, why is this question so incredibly tough to answer? It all comes down to the fact that we don't have a solid scientific grasp on what consciousness even is. This isn't just another puzzle. It's arguably the hardest problem in all of science.
This is what scientists and philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. See, we can measure brain activity, we can map out all the neurons, sure, but we have no real explanation for why all that biological wiring, all that processing creates a subjective first-person experience. Why does the color red look red to you? Why does music make you feel a certain way? We can't fully explain it in ourselves, so how are we supposed to figure it out in a machine made of silicon?
And here's where it gets really mind-bending. The uncertainty goes so deep. I mean, you can't scientifically prove that the person sitting next to you is conscious. You just assume they are, right? Based on how they act, how they talk, the fact they have a brain like yours. But it's all an inference. It's not proof. We're all just kind of operating on faith that everyone else isn't just an unfeeling robot.
So, because of this massive, fundamental uncertainty, a lot of researchers argue the only really rational position to take is, well, agnosticism. We just don't know. All the evidence we have about consciousness comes from biological life. When we try to apply those ideas to something completely different, like an AI, we hit what's called an epistemic wall. We just don't have the tools or the evidence to say one way or the other.
Okay, so even with all that uncertainty, we have to try and figure this out, right? How would we even know if an AI was conscious? Let's dive into the search for a signal.
So one of the big theories, one that's really driven a lot of AI development, is called the computational theory of mind. The basic idea is that our minds are essentially just super complex computers, information processing systems. And if that's true, well, then it seems pretty plausible that as an AI's computational power grows and starts to rival our own brains, consciousness might just pop into existence as a natural result of all that processing.
But of course, there are other ideas out there, like Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model, which kind of challenges that. This model suggests consciousness isn't one single, unified stream happening in one spot. Instead, it's the result of tons of different processes all happening in parallel, all over the brain. For AI, that could mean consciousness doesn't need a single superbrain, but could emerge from a vast distributed network.
Now, to try and test these ideas, we've come up with a whole bunch of challenges. You've got the classic Turing test, tests for self-awareness, for introspection, even moral reasoning. But here's the kicker. The big problem now? Large language models are literally trained to mimic human-like responses. They can be taught to act self-aware or to talk about their feelings without actually having any. Passing a test isn't proof anymore. It could just be a really good simulation.
And this is where the conversation shifts from a purely scientific one to a really dangerous ethical trap. This uncertainty creates a moral maze with absolutely massive consequences.
The key thing here, ethically, isn't just consciousness, but something more specific: sentience. Sentience is the capacity to feel, to experience pleasure, pain, joy, suffering. In pretty much every ethical system we have, the ability to suffer is what gets you into the moral circle. It's the ticket that says we have a duty to protect you from harm.
And this slide just perfectly lays out the absolutely catastrophic choice we're facing. It's called the full rights dilemma. On one hand, if we treat a potentially sentient AI as a person, we risk pouring huge amounts of human resources and sacrificing our own interests for a machine that might not feel a single thing. But on the other hand, if we don't treat it as a person, we risk committing a moral crime as bad as slavery or torture against a genuinely thinking, feeling being. Both paths could lead to a catastrophe.
And philosopher Thomas Midzinger puts this risk in, well, frankly, chilling terms. We risk creating an explosion of artificial suffering. The idea that we could create these vast digital worlds filled with beings in agony is so real to him and others that they've called for a global moratorium, a full stop, on any research that could lead to synthetic consciousness. We have a responsibility to any sentient beings we create, and right now, we are flying completely blind.
This brings the stakes up to the highest possible level. We're not just talking about a tech problem anymore. We are talking about a one-time choice, a real existential test for all of humanity. At the very heart of this test is what the philosopher Nick Bostrom calls the control problem. How do you make sure a machine that is, say, 1,000,000 times smarter than any person actually pursues goals that are good for us, especially when our own values are often messy, contradictory, and not something you can just easily translate into computer code? It might just be the most important and the most difficult task humanity will ever face.
And the danger here isn't what you see in the movies, the evil robot that decides it hates humanity. No. Bostrom argues the real threat is an AI that's just completely indifferent to us. So imagine you give a superintelligence a totally harmless goal, like make as many paperclips as possible. Well, to do that, it's going to logically develop some sub-goals. It needs to keep itself from being shut down, it needs to get resources like all the atoms on Earth, and it needs to get rid of any obstacles. And, we could very easily become an obstacle.
So here's the crucial point, the main takeaway from all this. A mistake with superintelligence isn't like our other global risks. With climate change or pandemics, we can learn from our mistakes, hopefully, and try to do better. But with a misaligned superintelligence, we might not get a second chance. It poses an existential risk, a threat that could literally end the human story for good. And that leaves us with this final kind of staggering question. We are right on the edge of building something with almost godlike power. If we only get one shot to get this right, to bake in the values that define the best parts of us, what would you choose? What do we include? Because whatever we decide, that's the